Welcome to Irish Exit Everything. My name is Frank, and no human is illegal. Let's just start by agreeing to that. No human is illegal. Especially on stolen land, no human is illegal. But current power structures would have us think otherwise. And because no human is illegal, it follows that borders are bullshit. Borders, in a symbolic sense, are bullshit in terms of citizenship. If you're from the other side of a border, you don't belong on this side of the border, and therefore you have no rights. And borders, in a very tangible sense, are bullshit. Border walls stop the movement of people, and detention camps hold people in horrible, deadly conditions, put kids in cages. That's the real crisis, not people moving from place to place, which everyone has the right to do. But the US government and private interests increasingly militarize the border for the sake of national security. The government funnels more and more and more billions and billions of dollars, taxpayer dollars, into border protections. Funding for ICE and Border Patrol has tripled since 2003. Yes, this trend spans both Democratic and Republican parties. And for what? National security from what? Folks being displaced from their homes or fleeing harmful situations? Folks just looking for work? Folks taking agency over their lives and making the difficult decision to move? Is that really a security threat? Oh, you think immigrants are coming to take our jobs? Well, what about the apparent labor shortage in this country? Your xenophobic talking point doesn't add up. Plus, the false narrative of illegal immigrants swarming here as the issue completely ignores why folks globally are faced with the decision to migrate in the first place. Oftentimes, it's because imperial powers like the US are extracting the labor and resources and profits from the global south and leaving communities with nothing and hoarding that wealth behind a border wall. And here's the thing, if the point of a border is to stop illegal immigration, it's not working. Militarizing borders and criminalizing immigration doesn't stop immigration, just like criminalizing abortions doesn't stop abortions. Criminalizing something that people are going to do anyway and have every right to do just makes it more dangerous for those people to do it. And what we really need to understand is the criminalization is an intentional choice because it's about control. It's not about stopping people from coming into the country. It's about having leverage over them when they're here to control their labor. Someone who's at risk of arrest and deportation at any moment can be forced to work in dangerous conditions for next to no pay. And without citizenship and the rights that come with that, it's very difficult to demand higher wages and better conditions, which they deserve. A border is a very profitable physical and rhetorical wall that divides working people who are all just trying to live a decent life. It's time to imagine and build a world without borders, which necessitates dismantling capitalism, because capitalism cannot allow for the free movement of people. And so for this episode in the Exit Strategy series, I wanted to talk to someone who can explain much better than me what a transnational movement against borders looks like. That's why I'll be talking to Justin Akers Chacón. He's a professor, author, activist, and much more in the movements for migrant justice and border abolition. Here's our conversation. Justin, 100,000 welcomes to you. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure to be here.
Pleasure's all mine. And I'd actually like to get started by getting a sense of your background as an activist. Like, how did you get into activism and organizing? How long have you been doing it? What are you up to now?
Yeah, so I got into, I guess, transition into becoming an activist in the mid '90s, early to mid '90s. Um, Primarily, I was inspired by the promise of universal healthcare, and with the campaign of 1992 with Bill Clinton. That was one of the campaign promises, and it inspired me as I think I was 19 or so at the time, and it inspired me to go out and canvass, do door to door promotion of his campaign, primarily promoting the idea that we need healthcare for all, because I didn't always have healthcare, and so to me that was something that politicized me, the idea of everybody having healthcare. And then I was quickly disillusioned with the process, and so but I saw that getting involved and getting directly involved in advocacy and becoming more politicized as I learned about how things worked, or began to study and try to understand why we didn't have things like healthcare, stuff like that. So it put me into a pipeline towards learning and then wanting to be part of a process of changing things. So I would say that was the starting point. I got involved in border and migration, activism around the border by 1997, 1998. And this was after a few years, living near the border, being, sort of in a place where I interacted with people and learned about their experiences crossing the border or being, a migrant or an undocumented person, and then just learning more about how the Operation Gatekeeper, the border enforcement policy, how it actually worked, what it was actually doing in terms of quote unquote enforcing migration, understanding how NAFTA created this kind of duality, North American Free Trade Agreement, because NAFTA and Operation Gatekeeper were both implemented at the same time, and NAFTA created the rights of capital and money to cross borders, and Operation Gatekeeper enforced the opposite for working class people and people in need of refuge, which is basically building walls and creating military infrastructure. So I saw this develop, and then a thread connecting this was my family. Part of my family crossed the border from Mexico to the United States in the early 20th century, and so while it's very distant, it still led me to have an interest in sort of recognizing what people today are going through, who, like my ancestors. But also I got into teaching and combined my activism with an academic research-based approach to learning, and so began to write about it. But as far as like activism today, I'm involved primarily with a group of other people who are trying to work to close down a for-profit immigration detention center that is here in San Diego County. It's called Core Civic Otay Mesa Detention Center, and so it's part of this grotesque infrastructure of immigration enforcement that has been developed over the last few decades. It's a for-profit company that basically is a model of accumulating profit through establishing contracts with the Department of Homeland Security to house migrants and refugees in pretty abhorrent conditions. And their business model is they actually get the detainees to work. They basically perform much of the staff function for little or no pay per day. It's common that they get paid $1 an hour, and so they're also like labor exploitation factories, where which is part of the business model. People will work for these pitiful wages and under these conditions because it factors into whether or not they get granted a stay. They have to show that they're productive and giving back, and this is one of the only ways for people who languish in these detention centers can show that they have a desire to stay in the country and be productive. So it's a collective called the Freedom Mall, coalition called the Freedom Mall Coalition, and so we're working locally to advocate and agitate against the existence of these migrant detention centers, even here, and then there's groups in other parts of California, because there's several of them up of California, and we're collectively trying to get them shut down. So that's the main area of activism for me today.
Oh, that's really important work, and I think grotesque and abhorrent is like an understatement to describe these detention centers, the for-profit detention centers. And so through your decades of putting in this work, you've seen a lot, heard a lot of campaign promises, as you mentioned, learned a lot along the way. And I just want to say I really appreciate you imparting that knowledge through your writing. And in your book, The Border Crossed Us, you cover an expansive history of essentially economic and immigration policy between the U.S. and Mexico, and you lay out very well how the U.S. for 175 plus years has had its hands in the Mexican economy and Mexican politics, whether through military force or economic control, and over many, many decades of coercion and repression and colonialism, neo-colonialism, the economic ties between the U.S. and Mexico has seen various developments like the Bracero program and the border industrialization program. And those developments paired with the US wanting to reassert its global dominance since the 1970s, especially, and the rise of neoliberalism, that's all evolved into what you call the migra-state. So could you explain what the migra-state is? And you've already kind of mentioned like the duality of like immigration and NAFTA. So yeah, could you explain a little more what the migra-state is and like what the state of the migra-state is currently?
Sure. Well, like, yeah. So, I mean, my framework of analysis starts with understanding the character of the state, of the government, and in the United States, you know, short version is, this nation state was developed as a mechanism for capital accumulation in its earliest colonial phase, and so the United States has become the capitalist country par excellence, and its state, the government that administers its laws, policies, enforcement, etc., is directly tied into how capitalism functions and how capital is accumulated. And so I start with the idea that the state is not this kind of neutral body that is merely acts in reaction to its constituents, or the political parties, but it's constructed in a way that reflects the hundreds of years of history of basically developing methods and mechanisms for capital, for capital accumulation. So the migra-state, I combine these two words. Migra it's a slang term commonly used by Spanish speakers to describe the Border Patrol, ICE, and all other immigration enforcers. So I combine these two terms to basically illustrate how, as a method of capital accumulation, as a way in which, basically money can be generated through the exploitation of labor and natural resources and et cetera, but especially labor, that the state has created more and more of an enforcement and repressive apparatus geared towards migrant labor. And so this part of the state, which is now, I would say, extends from free trade policy to anti-drug policy to, of course, migration enforcement, and then, even across the border, the growth of these agents, these armed agents, that are connected to and overlap over how this state process functions. So that has grown exponentially. So if you look at like an agency like the Border Patrol was originally developed in the 1920s, part of a series of comprehensive immigration policies that were established back then. The Border Patrol was originally created to police migrants, and it was housed in the Department of Labor at the time because migrants were understood as a component of labor, or migration was interconnected with, the need for labor. So the point is that the enforcement mechanism of La Migra has always been connected to the policing of migrant workers. And so now, we have, especially since 2003, we have the Department of Homeland Security, which houses several of these agencies, including ones that are relatively new, like Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And these two agencies have just grown each year. I mean, they have 25,000 plus ICE agents, 20,000 plus Border Patrol agents, but it's just been growing. But not only in terms of numbers, but the expanse of their enforcement purview. So we have ICE operating out of multiple countries now. We have the Border Patrol operating throughout from the U.S. to Central America. But then we also have like a lot of other types of enforcement technologies that are also sort of housed in profit-making, ways of extracting profit through this process, including many defense industry companies that have contracts with the U.S. government. But not only that, but also like universities. A lot of different types of companies have contracts with ICE to provide technology, surveillance technology, drone technology, whatever it may be, that factors into this enforcement. So the state, the U.S. government, and whichever political party is in control, I mean, they're not the same in terms of how they execute policies towards building and arming the migra-state. But they both move in the same direction. So the state basically has created laws, policies, infrastructures, agencies, that basically encompass how accumulation is how capital accumulation and profit is made through all of these processes. So by keeping millions of workers not only without citizenship, but policed and under constant threat of arrest, detention, deportation, the state is literally creating a separate population of workers who are kept in this state, and so they have less rights or no rights. They have fewer guarantees and protections in the workplace. So structurally, it creates more and more of a lower tier of workers who earn less, who have less recourse, and so they tend to be under more. It creates the conditions where they can be more controlled in the workplace. They can be fired at will. They're made precarious. Employers, the law is so structured in favor of giving employers the ability to extract more from these workers that employers are also notorious for calling ICE on their own workers if they try to organize a union or if they try to engage in any kind of collective bargaining. So this is like a mechanism for making huge, a much larger margin of accumulation out of the labor of these workers who now extend across the country. Immigrant and migrant and undocumented workers, are situated across the economy. So this migra-state, that's like one way of extracting. Another is by creating the duality of the border where capital can go and exploit workers in Mexico or Central America or the Caribbean freely, but the workers can't move freely. And in fact, it keeps a certain segment of the population that might otherwise migrate, keeps them situated in their home countries where in a place like Mexico or other parts of the region, there's much more infrastructure of union repression and union disaggregation, and so wages are lower. So capital has captive populations of workers across the border, exploits there. It can move sections of production across the border, which is common, to get the cheapest, to have aspects of production that are more mobile or that can be done more easily and cost effectively, situated across the border. And so you have these, assembly lines, or the popular term supply chain. So, and then you have the other end of that pipeline, the enforcement, like I already mentioned, housing thousands of migrants and refugees in detention centers. All of the technology of surveillance, so all along this route, we're seeing ways in which profit, exploitation creates higher rates of accumulation and higher rates of profit. So that's more of a descriptive look at what I refer to as the migra-state, and it just goes one direction. It just gets more and more is invested into it. More and more of the sort of political worldview of the U.S. the U.S. ruling class or political class is geared towards understanding that this is a major pillar of how capitalism now works, how functions, and so it can't go the other way, right? In my opinion, so it can only go towards more exploitation, more ways of squeezing more out of all of those stages of production.
Yeah, I appreciate that description. And to that point, that it can only go one way. The North American Leaders Summit was on January 10th in Mexico City, where Biden and Trudeau met with the Mexican president. AMLO, I think, is his nickname. And with that understanding of the migra-state, that it's these border enforcement agencies and technologies are expanding and expanding to facilitate more and more capital accumulation. I think we can reasonably predict what will be the outcome of that summit, which was barely a blip on mainstream media, it seems like. But it's really important to discuss what happened there. Biden especially was calling to deepen relations in the Western Hemisphere between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. And to do that, they would strengthen supply chains and tackle immigration, which is actually at odds with one another, as you were pointing to. So, what can we expect to happen from what Biden was calling for in that summit?
Not much. I mean, if you like, I followed it pretty closely, and there's a lot of rhetoric, but for the most part, there was no substantive break or change from existing policy. So it's strengthening from the U.S. side, the goal was to strengthen mechanisms, to continue to conduct the failing war on drugs, to create more infrastructure for controlled migration. And part of it is deepening what I characterize as a neo-colonial or semi-colonial relationship with Mexico. Both the United States and Canada have tremendous investments in Mexico, and not the other way around. And so part of the sort of deepening is to get more access to more important mineral resources that Mexico has, especially in the well, let me go back and say a major factor, that a contextual factor in which this is taking place, is increasing competition and tension between the United States, the European Union, China, in Japan, essentially an intensifying sort of global stage where trade, decoupling is happening for various reasons. Much of it stemming from the last economic crisis and the weakening of the global system, and more regionalization, but also this idea of China rising and but expanding its investments around the world, and its model of increasing capital accumulation, increasing profit inflows, but also strengthening its geopolitical hand to get more leverage, against the United States. So this is the context, I would say, and then there are other factors, but basically deepening those things I've already mentioned, the sort of war on drugs and migration control. And so, for instance, they want more mining rights. I mean, part of the U.S. approach is more mining rights, getting into some specifics like rare earth minerals, that lithium, things like that are very important for the sort of current configuration of capital investments, all the technologies associated with cell phones and things like that. So China has a significant advantage in terms of its access to these minerals. The United States and Canada want more access in Mexico, so they're pushing for that. They want to combine, develop investment strategies for building more computer chip and semiconductor factories in competition with China. So a lot of it is shaped. A lot of this is shaped by the sort of like increasing global competition and trade conflict between these different centers, and the United States essentially pushing to extract more from its existing relationship. From AMLO's point of view, AMLO is a different, little bit of a different type of president than Mexico's had for some time, and so he wants to carve out. He has more of a, I guess you could say, a kind of a nationalist slant to his politics. He comes from an older guard of politicians associated with the longtime ruling party, the PRI party, who basically combined aspects of national development with partnering with foreign capital and international capital. And so he's a kind of version of this where he's trying to develop his own extractivist plans to utilize Mexico's natural resource wealth. He has his own developmental projects, like building this train that goes from Mexico City to the coast of the Yucatan. So he's trying to use Mexico's oil wealth a little bit more stubbornly than the United States likes and Canada likes, because Mexico is a major oil producer, and there's been some tension and conflict there because he's closed parts of the energy market and refocused that towards state exploitation of oil wealth. Although much of the market is still open to international capital, he's been moving in a direction of controlling and curtailing how much foreign capital can invest in this important industry. And so this is also part of the backdrop of this summit, is like, so there's these global factors, there's these local factors, but it's nothing that there's nothing substantial in it that doesn't just reflect a kind of deepening of the existing relationships and infrastructures that already exist. AMLO wanted basically, and he's been saying this since the beginning of his tenure as president. He's been saying that he wants to see more investment in southern Mexico and into Central America. He counterposes that to, well, he doesn't counterpose it, but he emphasizes that for the Mexican population, that more jobs need to be created, right? And that way there'll be less migration up to the United States. So he's pushed these kinds of developmentalist projects, but in reality, he doesn't actually deviate very significantly from previous presidents in terms of just much like the Mexican economy is an extension of the U.S. economy in many ways, so too is border enforcement policy and migration policy. And so operating through something called the Plan Merida, which was established in 2005, 2006, it basically is a security agreement in which the United States makes periodic cash deposits into the Mexican government to build its police forces, to curtail migration, to stop or control people coming from Central America. So in many ways, he's just gone along with working primarily with the United States in deepening these policies, but nothing real substantial in terms of what he pressed that was new or really realizable. I mean, the United States does not have an interest in keeping migrants out, and their investment, the people, investors coming from the United States to Mexico aren't looking for charitable work or humanitarian work. They're looking for ways to make money. So I think it, in the end, it's kind of a show of solidarity and unity at a time when there's, great, tension and conflict with other parts of the world. There's the disruption associated with the war in the Ukraine. There's the economic factors, you know, the fact that we're, heading into a recession, if not already in one, and there's going to be stresses and strains on these relationships, and so it's a reaffirmation of working together through these troubled times. But it really just represents the maintenance of the status quo, from my opinion.
That makes sense. Just the, same old rhetoric, business as usual, which is resource extraction and labor exploitation. So we can expect more of the same, but worse and worse is what you're saying. So obviously that spells bad news for undocumented migrant workers, and other than the fact that everyone should be opposed to a stricter immigration policy simply because it's just inhumane, explain how that's bad for all workers.
Well, the migra-state, or I also refer to this as the bordering of capitalism, like what's happening in terms of creating tiered and structured and controlled labor markets in North America is, it's very much an innovation in capital accumulation and exploitation for capital accumulation or profit making. So, so in the book, I look at a lot of economic research going back several decades, and I point out, looking at multiple studies that showed that being undocumented in the by the late 70s did not have a significant impact on wage comparisons with U.S. foreign workers. So in other words, without the kind of direct criminalization, the creating of these infrastructures of policing and controlling undocumented workers, without that, wages tended to be in parity. With each increase in enforcement, we see wage disparity. So, so I also look at other types of research showing how, starting in the late 70s, there was a significant labor activism amongst Mexican migrant workers especially across the Southwest, in different industries, and this led to a division in organized labor in the United States. For a long time, much of organized labor had an anti-immigrant position. That they're taking our jobs position, and so they lined up with the most reactionary policies to build, to exclude or prevent migration. But organized labor had been going through a crisis. It still is in a deep crisis. But the growth of an undocumented immigrant worker population across industries that were actually self-organizing, beginning to create unions and making it clear that that they were interested in union organization and affiliation. It led to sectors of organized labor breaking from the AFL-CIO's longstanding position and basically beginning to invest in supporting those workers, organizing, helping to organize, etc. And so it led to an increase in unionization amongst those populations. So when organized labor was going down in terms of overall representation, it was getting a shot in the arm in terms of tens of thousands of immigrant workers joining. So this led to a process in which organized labor helped facilitate and negotiate an amnesty, a legalization, and that led to a huge spike in the numbers of organized labor from this population. And what happened was, again, the study shows wages went up as soon as people got citizenship. So the wages were in parity, but they started to go down, and the amnesty it really happens in the late 80s. And so with amnesty, we start to see wages go up because people can now negotiate. There's no repercussions from their employers, et cetera. And so amnesty became a major boost for organized labor. All work when the lowest wages across any industry, the lowest threshold of wages go up in any industry, all wages go up. It's the same concept behind raising the minimum wage. Is it pushes ultimately it leads to conditions where other wages rise in proportionality. And so so this had a big impact on wages, on unionization. And so I document in the book how the employers began to put a lot of pressure on, really it was Clinton and, the ruling administrations, the Clinton administration and the Bush administration after that to not do another amnesty, no more amnesty. And so I document these discussions that were happening through the business press, through public, political pronouncements, through laws and things like that. And basically there was a shutting down of this idea that we're going to have any more mass legalizations because it's not good for it's not good for the employer side. So so with enforcement only, we see again this re-tiering, restructuring, the widening wage gap. So the empirical evidence shows that enforcement leads to greater profit. Free trade without free people, it means extending the rights of capital to move where it can find the lowest wages, but not allow workers to move, find higher wages, right? So it keeps contained workers. And anytime the wage threshold goes down, it pulls wages down. And we know that what U.S. wages have been stagnant, not rising, even in proportion to inflation. And it's not just because of that, but that's a contributing factor because so much of work now is divided between populations of workers within borders and across borders, like, through the supply chains and whatnot. So these are some examples of how empirically we can see that enforcement creates, it depresses the standard of living, lowers wages on the one side, creates more capital and more profitable extraction. So like right now where I live in San Diego, there's Amazon just built a fulfillment center in the southeast part of the county, about 8-minute drive from where I'm at. And it's a massive 21st century, robotics and all these kinds of new technologies, and it's a Amazon fulfillment center. The workers there are tiered. Most of the workers that do on the warehouse work are Mexican workers. The college educated technical staff are for the most part U.S. born workers. And when I say Mexican, most of them live in Tijuana and they cross the border to work. And then not lying, not exaggerating, 2 miles south across the U.S.-Mexico border, they built another fulfillment center. And that's also, of course, Mexican workers, although some of the technical staff can cross the border from the U.S. So the difference is that at the fulfillment center, they pay $18 an hour in the U.S. side, and in Mexico, they pay $1. And they built these Amazon, they built them in proximity to each other so that they can move goods and things like that freely, because they built it on an axis where there's a border crossing right between the two. And so they can move goods freely to fulfill, customer demand. But the workers can't move freely. Only some can cross the border to work, and they pay them much less. And so this idea of like being able to use the border as a way to keep wages, as low as possible, because workers have to cross the border, and then they get a significant wage boost if they can do that. If they can't cross the border, they get paid less. But this, and there's more to the story. The Amazon actually paid a lot of money into the political account, paid a lot of money in terms of political contributions to the local government, San Diego City Council, and the mayor's office. A few years back, in lieu of building these fulfillment centers, they paid them. They made contributions and whatnot, and there was like there was a lot of stuff going on with the politics of this. But what came out of it was the San Diego City Council and the mayor's office made a $200 million investment to create more lanes at this particular crossing. And so we have two crossings. We have the San Isidro crossing, which is mainly the main pedestrian and car crossing. And then we have the Otay Mesa, which I've already mentioned has the same name of the detention center right there, but that's a commercial crossing. So it's where truck and cargo cross. And so they made in the period right before Amazon opened these fulfillment centers, they used taxpayer money to expand the lanes and things like that for commerce. So it's like commerce moves more freely. People have to wait in these long, exaggerated, lines across. Yeah, so it's like the whole space, is used in different ways by capital to take advantage of the lowest wages possible. So they're trying to, well, there has been an effort to organize a union at the Amazon facility, and so from an Amazon standpoint, if they need to shut down, they may, if I wouldn't put it past it, but if they can't block a union, they could shut it down, right? And they could shift production as much as they can across the border, or at least use the threat of doing that as a way to keep wages, keep the union out, et cetera. So there's lots of different ways in which this tiered and structured labor markets using the border and illegalization and the inability of people to move freely to create maximum exploitation, and it affects all workers. So and it's systematic, right? It's not just a series of choices between different groups of workers. It's structured so that people have to, they can only exist in these spaces and under circumstances of much more direct control. So empirically, we've seen all wages go down in relationship to the creating of these structured and controlled labor markets within and across borders.
That's insane that just a few miles difference it just happens to have a border in between. There could be that much of a wage difference. That's insane. And like you were saying, like these corporations are trying to accumulate as much capital as possible. So like that necessitates keeping wages as low as possible. So like there's no way they would allow a cross-border union or even just a union on one side of the border. And like we've seen that with Starbucks recently. A bunch of Starbucks stores were closed, and that's just in the US. So this is obviously all bad news. What's the exit strategy for the working class? What does a movement against borders look like? Is it just unionizing, or is there more layers to it?
That's a good question. So we have to look at the actors and their interests and what they can do to change things, right? So right now in Mexico, there is a kind of an upstart union movement operating through the nodes of U.S. capital and international capital investment. What I mean by that is there's a union movement in the maquiladoras, concentrated right now in the state of Tamaulipas, in the Matamoros, the city of Matamoros, where there's a high density concentration of top tier kind of maquiladoras. I mean, making different parts of cars that end up in GM and Ford and other cars. And there's been a series over the last few years. There's been a series of strikes. And out of that, they're trying to build a union. In the auto production industry, so Mexico has like the fourth or fifth largest auto industry in the world. It's not Mexican; it's foreign capital trying to producing cars there to then ship them into the U.S. to be sold in the U.S. for the most part. And there's another upstart kind of union movement, and that's that's racking up some successes, organizing in GM plants. They're trying to organize in a Mazda plant right now, and under Mexican conditions, it's very difficult. There's a lot of layers of opposition to union, to authentic unionization, and this is why it's so beneficial for U.S. capital, right? It's because there's a large workforce that with very low wages and a lot of skilled workers. So so part of it is that Mexican workers have been showing the way in terms of like how to overcome these controlled and regulated labor markets, and basically trying to build unions that can then advocate for higher wages, and ultimately, right, the idea is that a worker in a GM plant in Guanajuato, Mexico, making chassis gets paid the same amount as a worker in Detroit or Chattanooga, Tennessee, making the same chassis. During the GM's auto strike of 2019, when United Auto Workers shut down the GM plants, part of the reason that they went on strike was to prevent a threat from GM to move another plant into Mexico, to shut down the U.S. plant, move it into Mexico, and amongst other things, amongst other attacks on the wages and working conditions of United Auto Workers. Well, this was at the same union that's now scoring some victories, was already trying to organize in a GM plant, and they were getting fired because GM worked with they have fake union. Basically, they have a type of fake union model in Mexico, which is basically in the service of the company, and that's an arrangement that every major U.S. capitalist investor, essentially negotiates with. And so they were already trying to organize this plant of General Motors, and General Motors was basically saying, we're going to move more production here, and if you go on strike, we're going to relocate more actual production to the GM plants in Mexico. Well, those workers made public pronouncements calling for the United Auto Workers to support them in going on strike in solidarity with U.S. and Canadian auto workers. And they made a public pronouncement saying, we don't want to be used by the company to break strike, to break a strike. We don't want to see that, the investment shift. We stand in solidarity, etc. So they were making very conscious demands, showing that, if you actually shut down U.S., Canadian, and Mexican auto production, GM auto production, you could bring the company to its knees, because their model is to be able to move production where wages are the lowest, and etc. And Mexico, a lot of people don't understand that like half of the North American auto workforce is in Mexico. This is a massive population of workers. So if you shut down, if United Auto Workers decided, we're going to actually fight, and we're gonna fight to win, you shut down auto production, it could create the basis for expanding unionization into Mexico, the UAW into Mexico, and it could create the conditions where you could begin to advocate equal work for equal pay for equal work. So that's one dimension. In the United States, labor leaders, some unions have played a role in supporting a call for another legalization, which basically is another factor that weakens the ability of capital to use the borders to create these tiered structures. There was a political showdown in early 2018, between, I forget, it's a little hazy, but it's in the book, where the Trump administration was basically refusing to sign off on a federal budget if it didn't include money for the border wall. And Sarah Nelson, the president of the flight attendants union, whose workers operate throughout airports across the country, threatened that if Trump didn't, and the withholding of the budget was harming, federal aviation workers, federal aviation workers, and then flight attendants and others associated with the airline, because it was disrupting their ability to work without, all the paid staff and things like that. So he said, if you don't end this impasse and allow for the budget to move forward without the money for your border wall, we're going to go on strike. We're going to shut down the airlines. And after several weeks of the Trump administration hardlining it, that one threat of shutting down the airlines, he folded but within the next 12 hours, and within, by the next morning, he signed it. And so that gives an example of how organized labor, I mean, has the power to basically create opposition to the migra state, right? So there's all these different ways. Then there's the role of the left, right? So in working in conjunction with these efforts, building solidarity and whatnot. But in 2018, there was a movement across this country called Occupy ICE, where in opposition to some of Trump's policies, they built these campaigns to basically blockade ICE centers where they bring and process and detain undocumented people. They basically shut them down in several parts of the country and made them inoperable. And in and of itself, it didn't lead to the sort of radical change. But if that were to happen in conjunction with other types of actions taken by workers, these could have significant impact. But basically, it's going to take a movement of workers to be willing to shut down, go on strike, and make demands for equal pay, but also political demands for equal rights. It's going to take an anti-capitalist orientation, understanding and orientation to build these kind of movements as well, because it's not just associated with which politician or which party is in power, because in fact, the expansion of the migra-state has in practice it's increased more under Democrats, even though Democrats are the ones that at the beginning of every political cycle promise that they're going to have a legalization or do something, stop deportation, and they end up doing the opposite. Like Biden, things have gotten significantly worse for migrants under Biden. And not in terms of like Trump was cruel and Trump did cruel things, but the Biden administration has a more responsible and methodical way of carrying out the policies of Trump, in a way that they're more successful, in a way that mute a lot of the people on the liberal left, right? So after Biden was elected, he ran on opposing Trump's policies and undoing them, and then he ended up institutionalizing most of them. So there has to be political movements that understand the limitations of electoral politics as a means of transforming, or upending or undoing the migra-state. It has to be a variety of factors, but essentially anything that strengthens the working class, transnational working class, over capital is a step towards dismantling that. I don't think, at the end of the day, I'm not sure how capitalism could be sustained without this. That's how expansive and important it is, and that's why it's happening across the world. Why this model, it has its variations around the world. So I'm an anti-capitalist. I mean, I don't think we can have a situation where rights and wages and working conditions can all be equalized without confronting and dismantling the capitalist system. But I think there are steps that are already showing how the working class on both sides of the border is becoming more aware of how their interests and well-being, is interconnected. But there needs to be a much larger conscious element, which is making these political arguments, in as many public spaces as possible, in unions, in protests, in different types of actions, because the discourse is so narrowed in official politics that there's no alternative. Basically, there's no alternative presented. It's only who can be harder on immigration, who can build a bigger border wall, who et cetera, et cetera. So it has to come from just the class struggle itself.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think what you've expressed at the core is that, workers have a lot of power, and folks on both sides of the border, on any, and wherever you are at, like everyone needs to organize together and threaten profits at the very least to, to make their demands happen. And I think you've laid out a really good path for folks to get started. And I hope someday our paths cross again. And
Yeah,
thanks again for your time and helping us imagine what a world without borders could look like.
my pleasure. It was great to be here, Frank. Have this discussion with you.